Allora, buonasera a tutti.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. I also would like to thank the two other rooms which are connected. It's interesting that there is such a crowd here. He will speak English, so you might need the headsets. I will make a short introduction, then we'll give the floor to our guests, and we will devote a lot of time to Q&A so that we can have a discussion together. He's a sociologist, a writer, a journalist from White Russia. His article and his books have studied the impact of new technologies, but also indicate some line of reasoning while connecting the advent of new technologies and with the geopolitical scenarios, how new technologies are used, why it's so difficult to analyze them without their context. So his books have always been a very important reference point for technology enthusiasts. We'll speak about artificial intelligence, AI in China and the US, and the comparison between the two powers. The signs are already there because there are immediate consequences of that. You might have followed the discussion concerning custom duties and the desire of Trump to punish China for the budget and the trade surpluses. At present, the duties are about 25%, and they are scheduled to be implemented by mid-June. And the idea is to have an impact on in Chinese production. China has invested a lot on big data and AI in order to challenge the position of the US all over the world. I will speak about China, for I have lived there for about 10 years, and I have been, witnessing the changes that have happened in the past decade. Factory of the world, an economic model highlighting the low-cost production in Southeast Asia that had allowed the growth of China after the reforms of Deng Xiaoping. But change was already there in China. And in the year 2008, the Olympic Games took place. And after that, China had realized that there was a world crisis affecting the West in particular, and they witnessed a drop in the orders. So the attempt to modify the economy from an economy drawn by exports, China tries to be drawn by domestic market, and that is because of internal mechanisms, because of the process of urbanization and exponential growth of the middle class, and the attempt to turn quantity into quality. That meant leveraging on AI, technology, big data, and innovation. There are some moments in time which really were key in terms of legislation. First of all, the project by President Deng Xiaoping, which changed a lot the international standing of China. Till that time, everybody was indeed very suspicious. But then, after that, they took the lead in globalization, also owing to the isolation policies by Trump. And last year, the Davos Forum was inaugurated by the Chinese president, where he defended fiercely globalization. We have a project called China 2025, hinged on the idea to make China an economy drawn by AI, big data, and robotics. And Trump is there to strike on that project through sanctions. That to tell you that this challenge will go on for a long time. But the year 2030, China is determined to close the gap to the US. Another project is that called Internet Plus, which concerns AI. I'm not going into details now because I would like to give the floor to our guest without further ado. But first, I'd like to tell you that besides the two projects in China, there is a legislation asking all foreign companies collecting data to leave them on a Chinese server, and this is mandatory. So there is a clear attempt to control on part of the government on AI and big data. On the one hand, this is then to favor the export of high-tech products. Don't forget that the US buy robots from China mainly, and also because, domestically speaking, the mantra of the Communist Party in China is to maintain stability. I mean, nothing should change in the society. In daily life, the search for AI is a fact. China is achieving our dystopias. I might remember the Black Mirror program where people were assessed based on their social score. This is a system which is already there in China. So your position in the society depends on a number of elements. First of all, your criminal and administrative behavior. Some tried to buy a ticket and they were refused because they had not paid for a violation they had committed 10 years before. That might also be connected with the use of e-commerce instruments and so on. There are projects launched by companies like Alibaba, which had created a scoring system called Sesame Point, used to trace our online behavior on purchases in order to guarantee loans and to be on the safe side, to know that people could settle their debts. They also went beyond. They wondered, that person, is he or she buying Chinese or foreign products? Are they patriots or not? The Chinese central bank stopped these projects, saying that that was too much, but still the idea is on the air. Not only that, in China, many shops can be paid through face recognition. Last week, in Anzhou school near Shanghai, a pilot was started with TV cameras analyzing the behavior of students in the classrooms. There are a number of examples which are already there. The most advanced are happening in the most sensitive regions for the government. In the Xinjiang, northwest, majority of Muslims, but Uyghurs, who used to be a majority, then they were Chinesized, as it were, and the police Chinese is already using predictive models through cameras. There will be one TV camera every 3 Chinese in the future, with intelligent, smart cameras They sold them to the US, and an attempt was made to sell them to Italy, but the project was rejected. Through face recognition, where data matched with other data banks, some predictive models like Minority Report, so they are implementing our dystopias. Morozov has his own position about the ownership of data. He uses the adjective common. That means they should be owned by citizens. China is proposing their own model, which is not the American one, as we saw with the case of Cambridge Analytica, which was a private company. There will be a government control of data collected by Chinese and foreign companies, which will be forced, or rather mandated, to leave their data in the Chinese service, and no company will give up the possibility to work and market their products in China. So since the year 2030, there is a very precise plan to become better than the US in AI and big data. So this challenge is carried out in terms of trade influence, but which might give rise to very strong competition, and that will be the play game where the development and the future of artificial intelligence will be played. So the floor to our guest, and then we'll entertain the questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Simone, for this very good and very in-depth introduction also to the Chinese part of the story, which I'm sure you know better than I do. So let me try to give you an overview of what I think the main themes of this unfolding debate about artificial intelligence and geopolitics would be. And I will try to leave some time for questions for you and maybe from Simone at the end, but I really have a lot to tell you. So if it gets too fast, you have to wave at me because I tend to speak very fast. So before we get to the heart of the matter, let me just be clear that when I speak about artificial intelligence, I do not refer to the Skynet. I do not refer to the Terminator-like artificial intelligence that awakens and takes over the world. I'm talking about something much more banal, and I think that's also something that most people who analyze these issues from the economic side, and actually from the commercial side, have in mind when they speak about artificial intelligence. We're talking about still relatively basic and primitive ability to do relatively trivial tasks. Recognize certain objects one from another in photos, be able to recognize voices belonging to different people, being able to analyze photos and write a summary of what the system sees in the photos. So they might all look rather trivial to us because it's not the kind of full-blown artificial intelligence that mimics the human mind that we were promised in science fiction novels. However, I would argue that taken together, these functions, however trivial they seem, have an enormous influence, an enormous impact on economic and political activity, which is why everybody is so busy discussing them. And they're not offered by some kind of startups based in a garage. Even though there are quite a lot of startups working in AI, there's probably an area with the most startups per square meter in China or in Silicon Valley. But the majority of these services, as I talk about them, and I think as most financial newspapers like Financial Times and Wall Street Journal talk about them, they're offered just by a handful of firms. 4 and 5 of them American, and 3 or 4 of them Chinese. Right? So we're really talking about a relatively small number of players that have amassed this ability to offer this relatively trivial services. recognizing objects, recognizing faces, recognizing voices, and so on. Right? So we're not talking about every single startup in Beijing or in San Francisco. We are talking about the usual suspects: Facebook, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, IBM, which is more or less the American part. And also on the Chinese part, of course, we are talking about companies that are somewhat less well-known in Europe, but they are almost as big as the American ones. We're talking about Alibaba, Baidu, Tencent, JD.com, and a few others. Before I walk you through some of the dynamics of competition between these firms within the American market and within the Chinese market and what's driving them, I think it's very important to understand the exact point in the kind of arc of digital capitalism that we currently inhabit. Right? So I would argue that we are in a very particular point in the development of digital capitalism, and that's a point that is quite different from what came before. And this is where it's very important to grasp one particular transition. So up until roughly 2014, I would argue 2015, the dominant model of many of the firms in the United States, to some extent the firms in China, was online advertising. And in the case of Amazon, it was the sales of products, which most of us bought from these firms. It was primarily oriented to consumers buying stuff. So consumers buying stuff had to see some ads telling them that there are good products to buy, right? And they had to actually go and buy those products somewhere, which many of us did on Amazon. At some point in the development of those services, some of these firms, especially Amazon or also Google, they have recognized that there are many other domains and areas of doing business that are even more profitable than this consumer-facing business that they have been developing for decades. So instead of just selling goods and mostly goods actually to consumers, or advertising goods to consumers, we can actually start selling services to businesses and to governments. And if you start selling services to businesses and governments, instead of selling and advertising gadgets and all sorts of other products to consumers, you might potentially even make more money with it. Amazon was really the first one who grasped that development early on, because in around 2007, 2008, Amazon realized that it has a lot of spare capacity. It built a lot of infrastructures, it built a lot of server farms, it built a lot of basically unused capacity, which it needs in order to be able to sell its products. And it realized that it can actually rent out some of that capacity to other businesses who need to store their data, who need to store some of their sensitive information, who need to run certain services on top of that infrastructure and so forth. And they've discovered it up to a point where even CIA and much of the US defense establishment now hosts its data on Amazon servers. Okay? Having discovered that, and that, by the way, we're talking about the shift to cloud computing, right? It might seem that I'm talking about something relatively banal or something relatively obscure. No, I'm talking about a very profound transformation in how many businesses structure their in-house IT. Right? Basically, more and more of them, instead of just buying servers, storing the data inside the firm, taking care of all of it, they now just outsource it almost completely to firms like Amazon. And more firms have jumped into the mix because they have understood that Amazon, while it was not making a lot of profits, not a lot of revenue, but a lot of profits on selling goods, was making very high margins, very high profit margins on selling services. Okay? So all of a sudden, Google, a company that primarily was selling advertising, also started selling cloud computing services. Microsoft started doing it even earlier. A company that was primarily building software that powered our computers suddenly became a big player in cloud computing. So you can see that despite the current framing of this digital capitalism as being driven by monopolies, which to some extent is true, because Google has monopoly in search, Amazon has monopoly in selling products, these firms nonetheless still compete in some areas which are very important, and those are also areas where they happen to be making most profits. Because even Google makes more profits and has higher profit margins on selling services than it does on selling advertising. Right? And it's very important to understand this transition from selling their primary goods, advertising or products in the case of Amazon, to this idea where they're selling services. Because once they start selling services as firms, you can see that the sky is the limit in terms of what kinds of services they can be selling. So if in the beginning they were primarily selling cloud computing services, now Amazon offers you more than 100 different services through its Amazon Web Services package. Right? And those services include everything. You can basically upload an MP3 file, and Amazon will automatically transcribe it for you. Right? You can upload, so you essentially get a text out of an audio file. Right? You can upload a photo or several photos, and Amazon will recognize what objects are in that photo and will tell you that this photo goes in one folder, that photo goes into another folder. Basically, all these simple trivial tasks that I was describing to you at the very beginning, now they are offered as a service, right, whereby you pay for the usage of that service. So if you upload a text of 500 words, and you want Amazon to generate an audio MP3 file in a human voice, done, of course, through artificial intelligence, and then you want to download that file and use it somewhere else, Amazon will charge you per word. So the more words you have, the more it will charge you. And so for many businesses, this has created a very useful model whereby they can offload even more of their functions into the hands of those firms. So we are not just talking about them leaving their IT infrastructure in the hands of the providers of cloud computing. We are now talking about firms leaving functions that previously had to be done by secretaries, by clerical workers, maybe in some case by creative workers. All of those tasks are increasingly being farmed out to firms like Amazon. Google offers the same set of services, and so does Microsoft. Chinese firms, of course, are clearly driven by a similar set of incentives, even though in the case of Tencent and in the case to some extent of Alibaba, they managed to tap into other sources of revenue that were not advertising very early on. Because in the case of Tencent, there were many online games, there were many other sources of funding through which Chinese firms could actually become so profitable. So they were not as tied to advertising as Silicon Valley firms. But in China, nonetheless, the dynamic is very similar, in part because increasingly American firms and Chinese firms compete for the same global market. So the fastest growing company in terms of offering cloud computing and web services this year and last year is Alibaba, right? So we're talking about a Chinese firm that has come out of nowhere and is now competing with essentially Google and Amazon and Microsoft, offering precisely these kinds of services that I have been describing to you now. And all of them are essentially going after not just their own respective domestic markets, but they're also going after international markets, offering their services to clients in Russia, Latin America, the rest of Asia, Africa, and so forth, right? And they're offering it not necessarily to consumers, but they're offering it also at enterprise level and at the government level. The reason why I emphasize this transition so much is because it's very important to understand that the transition away from online advertising as the dominant mode to essentially collect data, right, and to essentially offer many of the services will have immense repercussions for also how the internet, quote unquote, looks like today. Because you have to understand that in the process of sticking to this first stage of their development, where all they were doing was working with consumers and selling advertising and selling products, these firms have, of course, accumulated huge tons of data. Not only have they built immense data centers, which Amazon then managed to rent out as infrastructure, they also managed to amass quite a lot of personal data and enterprise data, which later proved extremely useful in building some of those artificial intelligence services. And that, of course, is what paid for many of the free services that we have been enjoying. So the reason why we pay nothing still to use Google or to use Facebook is precisely because, as all of you by now should understand, there is an implicit extraction of data from all of us, which then is monetized in different ways. I'll give you a quote from Andrew Ng, who was the head of AI at Google and was then also the head of AI at Baidu, so he had kind of been in both worlds. And speaking at Stanford last year, he said something that I think is very key to understanding the dynamics of the digital economy. He said that in big tech firms, we often launch products not for their revenue, but for the data that they allow us to extract. And then we find a way to monetize that data differently. Right? Which I think is a very honest explanation of how the digital economy functions. Meaning that all of us are getting, in a sense, a massive subsidy to use Google and Facebook and to some extent Amazon for free. And then with the data that is accumulated, these firms find ways to actually monetize it. At the beginning, it was advertising. Now it became services, including services of artificial intelligence. Let me give you one example. So, and that's an example that I think is used very often, but people don't understand the full chain of implications here. So every time that you use Google, when you use it in a way that Google finds suspicious, right, it will, of course, ask you to prove that you're not a robot. Right? And that has happened probably to all of you. Right? And whenever Google suspects that you are a robot, it asks you to do some task. Right? And most often it's a task which begins by displaying you 9 photos, taken mostly in urban settings, where you're being asked to find, all the boats that you see in the picture, or all the cars that you see in the picture, or to identify all the, front shops or something of that kind, right? And you should keep clicking until you finish, right? And once you've done that, you move on. You get access to your content. As of course, most of you probably, I hope so, have been suspecting, that's a very clever way for Google to teach its own AI systems how to do object recognition. Because essentially, they have deployed plenty of cars to go around the world and take photos of the urban environments, but the cars themselves, of course, don't know what it is that they see. And deploying the ability of hundreds of millions of people, if not billions of people on a daily basis, to analyze those photos and tell Google that this is a car, and this is a boat, and this is a street light, it comes in very handy, because it ultimately helps Google to develop image recognition and image identification capacities, which they can later insert into other services, which they will sell to commercial and government clients. So if you've read the newspapers carefully last month, you must have seen that there was a big protest inside Google, led by its own engineers, whereby they were actually rebelling and telling that Google should not be working with the Pentagon. Because Google entered into a deal where some of its technology was used by the Pentagon in order to basically recognize objects when it was operating its drones. Right? Because drones also need to be able to recognize objects, not just self-driving cars. So indirectly, every time we teach Google that we are not a robot, right, we are enhancing the capacity of institutions like the Pentagon to identify houses in Yemen that they're going to strike through the drones, right? Which, of course, is not something that occurs to all of us, but it's something that's immediately monetizable by Google. Right? And when you can deploy millions of people to work for you for free, to be able to identify these objects and those photos, and then you have the ability to sell that service to an institution like the Pentagon, you have a pretty good business model in front of you. Now, there are many implications that flow from the shift from advertising to services, which I'm not going to explore today because we want to focus on geopolitics and AI. But I think it's very important to understand that one of the consequences and questions that we should all be asking is who's going to pay for the provision of all these online services, right, once these firms no longer need us as providers of data. Right? That's just something to put in your mind, because clearly there would soon arrive a moment where Google, Amazon, Facebook, and all the rest of them can make much more money by essentially dealing with governments, the Pentagon, banks, and the industry than by continuing to serve as ads. Right? And when that moment arrives, they have very few reasons to continue subsidizing our use of those systems. So that's just something to put at the back of your mind. So the reason why China, but also a couple of other countries, including, by the way, Russia, Putin made a very big remark last year when he said that whoever controls artificial intelligence is going to control the world. It's not just China, right? So you have more and more countries suddenly waking up to the possibility that the economy, nationally and globally, gets restructured in a way that more and more power concentrated in the hands of technology firms. These technology firms could be American, they can be Chinese, they can be Indian, they can be Japanese, it does not matter. But there is a cluster of technology firms that suddenly intermediate many other sectors. Just look at what Google intermediates, right? They offer services that analyze healthcare data in order to predict, the occurrence of kidney disease. They analyze energy data inside their own data centers to cut their own energy costs by 40%. They analyze traffic data in order to be able to predict when to turn on, traffic lights and when not to. They analyze all sorts of other urban data because they're also building their own smart city. Right? So there is tons of spheres and domains of life that are suddenly intermediated by this cluster of firms. And these firms, as I have explained, their business model in many cases is very simple. They just come, extract as much data from whoever they happen to be working with, then they repackage that data and offer the services somewhere else. Now, if you think about it from the perspective of a country that is a developing country, that is trying to grow its own industry, perhaps information industry, if not heavy industry, and essentially come out of a world that is rather rural still, predominantly, and based on a very different economy that's still very much underpinned by agriculture, of course, you would be very preoccupied with who controls these key gateways to economic and political activity in your country, right? And if you look at the history of American interventions in global trade policy over the last, I would argue, 40 plus years, what you would discover is that China is not the first one to wake up to this danger. Right? In the 1970s, if you go and read many of those debates quite closely, you have a lot of developing countries, so so-called Group of 77, the countries of the non-aligned bloc, who become extremely concerned about the fact that big American computer firms like IBM come to their countries, essentially destroy all the local competition, establish themselves as the primary providers of the most important services, do not want to store any data locally because they argue that that increases compliance costs, and then essentially exit whenever it suits them or whenever the profit environment changes. So, of course, a lot of countries have been trying to make it much easier for themselves to A, build their own computer and information industry, B, impose restrictions on what they can do with data, and particularly data of their own citizens, which is very often simply extracted from those countries and taken elsewhere. And they have been defeated in those efforts. They've been defeated in those efforts very often by very powerful American companies like IBM, and they've been defeated in those efforts through trade treaties, right, which continuously for the last 40 years pursued the objective of removing any barriers to trade in services and, by extension, removing any barriers to trade in data. So one of the big slogans of free trade campaigners in the United States has traditionally been that we want to support free flow of data. Because free flow of data essentially allows our firms to set up business anywhere, not be faced with any local constraints on its use, and essentially repatriate it home and work with it according to the US privacy legislation, which is not often very strict. You compare it to the European one. And that has been a very consistent stance that virtually most countries, including, by the way, the European ones, had to more or less comply with, until China has managed to get enough, how should I say, strategic insight into understanding, A, the role of data and its connection to artificial intelligence, and B, the need to control that crucial layer of intermediary activities that is now dominated by the tech firms. And as soon as China understood it, they have been taking very strategic, clever steps to A, grow their own domestic technology industry, B, do something about data legislation so that the data of Chinese citizens would not be enhancing the ability of Google to sell its services to the Pentagon and thus make a lot of money on the data that does not belong to the citizens of their own country. And C, to essentially do everything to engineer with very clever industrial strategy a domestic tech industry that would be able to compete with the American one. Of course, it took quite a lot of power and quite a lot of, let's say, negative reactions from the West, because ultimately one way to do it was to essentially cut off access to big American tech firms in China. So they had to embark on a very massive censorship spree where the likes of Google and Facebook have been banned, but not only because the Chinese wanted to restrict the political activity happening on those sites, but also because they essentially understood it as an instrument of trade and not just an instrument of censorship. So for me, the Great Firewall of China is primarily a trade instrument as a way to protect and nurture their domestic industry, and only secondly, an instrument of censorship. And having more or less ridden themselves of these big American firms, they have managed to cultivate their domestic ones, but also do it in a way that is tied to a broader strategy of coordination between sectors, between industries, and between what each of these firms can be contributing to the overall development plan of the Chinese government. So if you look at what their firms are tasked with doing, all of the big firms now has a particular theme, a particular topic that they sort of curate. So Alibaba is tasked with implementing the strategy on the smart cities. Baidu, the search engine, is tasked with implementing the strategy on autonomous driving and autonomous vehicles and self-driving cars. Tencent is tasked with improving healthcare services that are based on data and AI. All of them have something that is quite specific, and they're tasked with it by the government. Now, we can debate to what extent this is a healthy model and what political consequences it has, but it's much more coordinated and is much better targeted with the overall strategy of national development than anything that you can see in any other country. Now, of course, I might have given you a somewhat misleading picture in talking so much about data, because artificial intelligence, and especially deep learning, they're not just about data, right? You also need two other rather important components. One, of course, is people. You do need to have quite a lot of smart AI researchers and students and academics who will be contributing to the development of your own domestic effort, which is something that is very hard to do in a country that might not have had so many graduate programs in artificial intelligence. And second, of course, you also need hardware. And above all, you need chips. And because it's primarily by having a robust chip industry and semiconductor industry that you can make a lot of headway in building your own domestic AI capacity. So in the case of the United States, that domestic AI industry has, of course, been developed as the result of the Cold War. And in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, you have seen companies like Intel and a little bit later on in the 90s, company like NVIDIA, which essentially managed to fill in the gaps in the microchip sector. So in America, the situation is quite good with regards to microchips, and it's quite good with regards to data. Insofar, because of American universities, it's also quite good with regards to human talent. Now, if you look to China, their main hurdle is and remains the inability to essentially build their own autonomy with regards to chips. Right? And that explains much of the recent activity and much of the reaction that we have now seen from Trump. Because ultimately, the only effective way for the Chinese to do something with regards to their chip dependence is to either heavily invest in their domestic chip industry, which they have done by creating a national chip fund, which has $25 billion to spend on subsidizing various acquisition deals with regards to chips, and B, it's to essentially go abroad and purchase as many chip companies as possible, right? And then somehow integrate their know-how into the Chinese system. And the Chinese have done it with some other industries. If you look at robotics, where they just go and purchase entire robots, mostly industrial robots in firms, they have purchased quite a number of very big important firms, primarily in Europe, which did not really have much discussion about it, and they don't really have much instruments through which to protect itself. So the Chinese came to Germany, they bought one of the most important robotics firms, they came to Italy, they bought another robotic firm, they have bought quite a few robotic firms. With chips, the situation is not as simple, because many of the big chip firms in Europe have already been bought by other foreign investors. In the UK, a very big firm got bought by SoftBank, which is a huge player in the technology sphere, to which I hope I might return later on in this talk when questions. And now you see one of the big Dutch chip makers, called NPX, is about to be purchased by the Americans, Qualcomm. So the reason why Trump blocked one of the largest M&A, merger and acquisition deals in history, which was a takeover of the American Qualcomm by the then Singapore-based Broadcom, was precisely because Americans, having understood what the Chinese were doing in the microchip space, they were afraid that their own crown jewel, well, one of the crown jewels, because they also have Intel and NVIDIA, Qualcomm, will essentially be starved out of R&D money if Broadcom purchases it. So Trump blocked it, right? And the motivated quite explicitly was the reference to China, which is trying to assert its power in this space. I still think that the future for the Chinese efforts here is quite bright, in that there are other hardware firms, despite the fact that America is doing everything to essentially disable and destroy them, both ZTE and Huawei, they're under intense pressure in the United States. Huawei, for example, is still nonetheless proceeding with its own plans to build its own chips, right? And they have introduced, actually, their own chips in the phones. In the Mate 10 phone, there is a Huawei-made chip, and it's one of the few chips that are made in China. With regards to many other metrics, China is doing exceedingly well. And is doing exceedingly well precisely because there is just so much money pouring into AI from the central government, from these big, giant internet and hardware firms that are all very profitable and have a lot of money to spend. And there is also coming from regional funds, from regional towns and councils and so forth. There is also massive pools of money there, which explains why China is doing so much better, even in the United States, and even certainly than Europe, on most indicators. Number of patents granted in the field of AI, number of academic papers published on deep learning and AI in top journals, number of startups funded, a number of funds attracted. All of that money is flowing to China, right? And it's flowing to China precisely because the environment, despite the seemingly authoritarian outlook of the country and seemingly rigid nature of its legal system and political system, the environment seems to be much more flexible and fluid. There are not many laws that are enforced about privacy, so there is quite a lot of leeway that these firms have in doing with the data of the users, whatever it is that they want to do with it, which is not the case in Europe, and is still not the case to some extent in the United States. These firms fulfill many of the niches and provide many of the services that traditional actors, economic actors, just do not provide. I mean, so there is a reason why most payments in China, especially in coastal cities, are handled by, tech firms. Why? Because the banking industry and the consumer banking industry and the payment industry just wasn't there to do it. So if you go to China, you wouldn't even be using cash now to pay for most of the products and services that you are buying, in part because everything can be paid for with Alipay and many other systems that are directly integrated in your phone. WeChat and so forth. In many of them, you can even now pay with your face because, again, this is another kind of development that you can only get in China because they have two big firms. So the largest startup in facial recognition right now is in China. It's a company called SenseTime. And there is another one of similar size. I mean, SenseTime is valued around $4.5 billion, so it's not a trivial startup. And the reason why they're so much ahead of the American, let alone European competitors, is because the Chinese government let them access its own database of 700 million citizens and their photos. So when you have access to 700 million citizen photos, of course you can do quite a lot of advances in facial recognition, which is what they did, and now they go and cross-sell and cross-license their services in facial recognition to all the other parts of the Chinese economy. I would argue that, if you look at, for example, their own Uber, it's this company called Didi, there it's already integrated. So this facial recognition technology is already integrated in their services. So what we're seeing is a very different model with much more money and much more coordination at all the levels. I mean, just to give you one example of how seriously the Chinese take it, last week they introduced a textbook for high schools about AI, which, I can bet in the next few years it will become obligatory. An obligatory text in all the high schools where children from the early age will be taught the basics of AI and what it means. In part because, the government has recognized what important factor it will be for the development of the economy as a whole. So speaking about the likely sources of conflict, right, and the likely hurdles, of course, what Trump is doing now, with protectionism and kind of a very retaliatory response to some of the Chinese companies, it's not necessarily anything new, because many of the concerns about the aggressive growth of Chinese technology companies were already raised by Obama and by his Commerce Department. And it was actually them who started many of these proceedings against the ZTE, the Chinese firm that now has been brought almost to complete stop, right, because of the sanctions and because of the bans that we imposed on American companies that are dealing with it. So America itself, under Obama, was quite cognizant that its own technological hegemony was slipping away. Right? And we often do not pay attention to it. But, in fact, America, especially after the end of the Cold War, did enjoy almost 2.5 decades of almost uncontested technological hegemony, where much of the world depended, essentially, on their services, whether it was Google, or whether it was Yahoo, or whether it was Microsoft. And we did so without necessarily drawing the necessary political implications and conclusions from it. And so for quite a lot of countries, it seemed absolutely normal that you would go and introduce services from Google or Facebook or Amazon into your own national infrastructure, including national security issues, including, healthcare and education. And it seemed quite a reasonable thing to do, because there were almost no political concerns raised about the provenance of those tools and systems. Right? I think that techno-hegemony, if you want to put it that way, was thrown into something of a crisis mode as we started seeing revelations coming first from Edward Snowden with regards to the way in which American tech firms seem to be all too close to American intelligence agencies. We have seen another challenge to it more recently with regards to the Cambridge Analytica scandal. But above all, we have seen a challenge to it coming from a source that few of us in Europe anticipated, coming from China, whereby Now we have to essentially in Europe make a decision between Chinese suppliers of the same services and American ones. Because ultimately, when it comes to AI and when it comes to when it comes to cloud computing, we still see American firms dominate the scene, right? So both Facebook and Google make much of their money, let me put it, I think 53 and 56% respectively, abroad. They do not make it in America. So most of their revenue comes from abroad. In the case of China, it's still relatively trivial. So Chinese firms mostly service the domestic market, right? But they start expanding. And I can assure you that within the next 5 years, the crucial decision facing, unfortunately, most municipalities, cities, and governments in Europe would be not what kind of AI we should be using and developing. It would be whether we should be buying from American suppliers, which lead and feed our data directly to the National Security Service agency, or the Chinese ones, which feed it directly to the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, unfortunately, that's the sad choice and dilemma that is looming on our horizon in Europe. And despite some of the more recent moves by European politicians who seem to have finally woken up, so, you see Emmanuel Macron making all these big pronouncements about the importance of AI. What did he dedicate to it? He dedicated out of the national budget, if I remember correctly, 3 billion euros to the development of AI. That's what China spends in a week on developing AI. So it's not, I'm overstretching it a bit, but just look at one program. So I think one of the more important projects, I don't think you mentioned it, but the program for the development of AI, which is their strategy until 2030. It's different from Made in China 2025. So there is also another strategy, which was announced last summer. And it's a plan to development of AI in China with the goal of achieving total world domination in AI by 2030 that commits, if I'm not mistaken, 135 billion to the development of AI just from the central government budget. Right? So we're not talking about local governments, regional governments. We're not talking about venture capital funds of big tech firms in China and all the private investment that's coming to China for AI. Right? So Europe has a hard time catching up, but it's also not obvious what Europe wants to be doing in this field. And I think that's one of the more problematic areas, because even the initiatives that were announced by Macron, they do not, as far as I understand, in any way seek to create an alternative pole, an alternative system to the Chinese and to the American ones. Primarily, it's a matter of enabling American firms to set up European campuses in places like Paris so that they can actually come and hire all the best talent in Europe and put them to work in American firms, which will need that talent in their global war for AI with China. Right? So Europe at this point is a nice place to live with relatively well-trained talent, but it's not anymore a driver of some kind of an alternative development for AI, which, of course, it could fulfill if it really wanted to think about this matter strategically, and if it could politically and economically. There is clearly a large gap in the market, so to say, because ultimately we probably want to have AI systems that do draw on a lot of data that we contribute, but do it in a way that do not compromise our privacy, which we actually in Europe cherish still quite a bit, which is not the case in China for cultural and political reasons, and seems to be not the case in America anymore. Right? We want to build it in a way where there is a more robust distribution of power between various actors involved in this. So it's not just the central government, as in the Chinese model, that gets to appropriate all the power about AI in its use, which clearly it's a fantastic system for A, policing, as you know from China, and B, for making sure that people stick to the kind of script, if you know what I mean. So in China, for example, now, how do you become a good, credible citizen? Of course, you take a loan, like happens to be the case in many European and American countries. So you take a loan, and then that loan that constrains you. So the social credit system that you've heard about is one way to make sure that everybody can qualify for a loan, can take that loan, and can actually then behave reasonably well to pay it back. We do know that now they're using AI to actually analyze video applications for the loan and judge based on those video applications whether the person is credit worthy or not. So essentially, you sit in front of a computer, you're being asked a couple of questions, you record your video answers to it, you upload the video to the bank, and then the bank, using AI, analyzes your facial expressions as you respond to the videos, and then makes a judgment as to whether you deserve a loan or not. So for those kinds of users, of course, centralizing power and data and capacity in the hands of just one industry, one firm, and one government, it can be fantastic. I suppose that that's still not the world which we in Europe would like, to some extent, to have and to build. Which means that, we can have a system whereby data is collected locally, to some extent, but not everything is done at the central level. There are plenty of things that can be done by local municipalities and town halls and communes, right, and cities, in a way that would actually be not as draconian as it would be if it was all done by the national police or national intelligence agency or national security agency, right? And I think that there is nothing for us to be scared of, that in a sense we can think of alternative ways to build transportation services that will be as flexible as Uber, but they will be entirely controlled by the citizens or by the municipality, or by the municipality and the citizens in common. And they will be driven by some kind of AI, which clearly will be largely financed by the central government, but it would nonetheless be administered and run locally. Right? And I'll tell you why I think this is such an important question to resolve. So one thing I didn't tell you about digital capitalism and the way it's going is that you see immense concentration of ownership of who owns these firms and what kind of money is poured into these firms. So many governments and many sovereign wealth funds and many big institutional investors have recently discovered that so-called digital platforms and services of artificial intelligence are probably likely to be the most profitable investments they can make in the next decade, given the paucity and the lack of any other investment options. So given that everything else, from bonds to stocks, will pay them in the good case, in the best case scenario, 4 or 5%, many of them are more than happy to lift their stringent investment requirements and actually invest in startups where they would never invest before, which explains why a company like Uber is funded by essentially a bunch of sovereign wealth funds, Goldman Sachs, and a number of other institutional investors. And that is the case for many other technology companies. They go and take a lot of money from institutional investors and sovereign wealth funds, and in many cases, if you look especially at the Gulf countries and Southeast Asia, those sovereign wealth funds borrow the money. So they're very happy to borrow cheaply, invest into companies like Uber and Airbnb, harness all the returns, and then be very happy. Now, I'll tell you why I think it's problematic. So if you look at the biggest investor in the technology space right now, it's probably a company that many of you have not even heard of. So it's the Japanese company called SoftBank. Okay? So SoftBank is an immense firm that has its hands in a number of businesses. They run a mobile operator in Japan. They own a mobile operator in the United States. But they also own a fund called Vision Fund, which is quite big. It's around $100 billion. And they are rumored to be setting up another fund, which will be $200 billion. So with this fund, they have attracted a lot of institutional investors, including, by the way, the sovereign wealth funds of Saudi Arabia, of United Arab Emirates. There is a sovereign wealth fund of Bahrain that's discussing to join them. And they're going around and buying all the companies that they can, that do artificial intelligence and that do robotics. Right? So if you have seen this viral video that was flying around the web a couple of months ago of a robot dog opening a door, right? It was a very popular video that got a lot of traction online. So that's a company, Boston Dynamics, that used to be owned by Google, right? And now it's owned by SoftBank. and its primary contractor is actually the military and the Pentagon. So, and SoftBank, by the way, it's not that it's just a company with very deep pockets. It's a company that just knows how to borrow very well. So the actual debt of SoftBank is something around $130 billion. So it's a company that borrows very well and very cheaply, and then with the money that they borrow and that they raise from other funds, they go and purchase all the promising firms, including, by the way, Uber, investing a lot of money in Airbnb, and so forth. The reason why it's very important to understand is that you have to grasp something very basic. Once a company like Uber, right, takes over your local transportation service, and I'm all for having a transportation service that will be much more automated, much more flexible, and it will be actually much more pleasant to use. So there is no argument from me about that. Once a company like Uber takes over that service, you clearly see where things will be going 5 years from now. And where they would be going is in a very simple direction. Right now, Uber is losing money almost everywhere it operates, but especially in North America. They lose something like $1 billion a year in North America only. Right? And the reason why Uber can afford to lose so much money is because Uber is able to tap into the deep pockets of institutional investors and big funds like the one of SoftBank. So they can afford to lose a lot of money while all of their competition essentially dies out and gets destroyed. And then it's up to them what they will do later. Right? If they can, they will raise the prices, which will make a lot of the customers unhappy, or they can do something else. They can essentially accelerate the process of automating the driving process, which is what they have been investing in for the last 5 years, essentially replace the driver with the self-driving system, which will allow them to keep the prices where they are, but get rid of the labor entirely. Now, once you get rid of the labor, in that case entirely, what you're left with is a company owned by the likes of SoftBank, Goldman Sachs, and the government of Saudi Arabia that essentially operates your transportation service in your local city, on your local town, which leaves very little money locally because there are no drivers who drive and get paid and buy services locally. All of that money was maybe, if somebody finds a creative way to tax Uber, some of that money might stay locally as taxes, but much of that money goes somewhere else. Right? And that, I would argue, is the generalized model on which many other services, from healthcare to education to insurance to traffic optimization, will be offered in the next decade. And if that's the model on which many of the services will be offered, you could not possibly imagine a better future than actually, instead of surrendering all these services to the likes of SoftBank and Uber and their friends in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, instead, you can actually have a system where citizens and cities and municipalities have some control over it, where they actually own it, right? And where some of the profits and revenues made with that system locally are returned back to the citizens themselves. In part because a lot of the data that feeds into this automation or artificial intelligence behind the system already comes from those citizens. And that, I would argue, is a system on which Europe can build a somewhat different model with the right configuration of political and economic factors. Right? I'm not arguing that that's going to be very easy to do because it will go against many of the even basic ideological premises of the project, on which Europe actually is founded. But nonetheless, I think that there is a niche. And I would argue, by the way, that will be exact same outcome if the role of Uber is played by Didi, the Chinese firm. Ultimately, they share the same investors. Uber and Didi both have SoftBank as their main shareholder. So at this point, we can go and find some interesting differences between national capitalisms and the way in which national capital reacts to incentives and pressures differently. But ultimately, at the level of ownership and who sets the direction, in many cases, it's the same global firms. So on this, I will probably be concluding just by saying that the way in which artificial intelligence will restructure local and national economy, to me, seems quite clear. It also seems obvious that we are living through immense concentration of power of doing it in the hands of just a couple of firms in the United States and in China. I think there is still time, provided that enough money will be found to invest into the development of such systems in Europe. In the absence of that, I think having more centers of this rather than one, meaning that having something very robust happening in China and not just in the United States, is overall a good thing. And on this, I will end. Thank you.
Mentre facciamo prendere un po' fiato.
While you recover your breath, artificial intelligence 2.0 envisages documents and investments till 2030. In the past Congress of the Communist Party, the President mentioned moderate prosperity program till 2049, i.e. 100 years from the creation of the People's Republic of China. Before entertaining questions, in the public debate on AI in China, issues are connected with privacy. The head of Baidu, who declared national TV that Chinese are available to lose their privacy if they have advantages. A middle class is being developed. There was a very fierce discussion on the environment. In China, something is considered as a hurdle to AI is the education system, which historically has been based on Daokao, an exam like the baccalaureate, which opens the doors to the university or the labor market, and it's a very rigid system. As Eugenie said, artificial intelligence is in the curricula of schools and in a computer science university. And they also used a drone, filming the students so that they can indeed get used to what they are studying in practice. Let me add that I agree with what you said. Something we call censorship is experienced in a different way by the Chinese people. It's a real barrier, an economic safeguard to protect local companies' development. Facebook, YouTube, and Gmail, WhatsApp are in a way censored, but as a matter of fact, the Chinese people did not use them because they had other products such as Ran like our MySpace. So there was an evolution of applications in China, so much so that, as you said, in China people don't go around with wallets and purses. They use WeChat, which is a consumer-to-consumer app in China to book a visit at your doctor or book the restaurant and so on. As a matter of fact, in Europe, it works as a business-to-business app. It's a company facilitating the entry of Western companies in China. Are there any questions?
Sì, ne raccogliamo un po' così poi risponde a...
We collect some questions and then you will answer.
Sì.
La posso fare in inglese o in italiano?
In inglese, sì.
Allora, thank you for the talk. I'm a student here in Trento, and I have one question. We're in, we can call it an impasse, that of the single script, as you called it.
That's real-time censorship. It's done.
Yeah.
There's a Chinese drone maybe outside.
So we're in impasse. And do you see any feasible way of distributing these centralized systems? And what kind of system do you imagine that brings us from this script to something that maybe your friend Clay Shirky would call something like many narrations?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay. I would like. I appreciate the. Thank you also from myself for excellent talk, and I'm fascinated about your proposal of a supposed pole of artificial intelligence in Europe at a level generated at a level of the municipality. I think I work in a municipality, and I think that there is a huge. This is the biggest amount of data that you can base on for doing artificial intelligence on. But I'm quite skeptical about the critical mass you can afford to build in such a way. I appreciate a lot what Barcelona is doing in this field now, using open source software, using data from the citizen and so on, and trying to build services based on local owned data. Mm-hmm. How do you think we can cope with this in the future in Europe? We are facing a level of non-coordination in Europe about all the struggles we have faced from the other part. Okay. What do you think about this?
Hi, thank you for the talk. Do you see this as a further threat, the moving from online to offline? We have seen recently that Amazon has bought Whole Foods, and so this is the first move. But it would be very interesting to know what you think about.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Rispondo?
Saying that we should seize the means of production, so I love that implicit message in there. A question, what's your take on GDPR? Is it too little, too late, or, general?
Okay. All right. So, with regards to how we can, I think some of them are kind of overlapping, but so with regards to how we can deviate from this centralized system script, right, that you asked about, I think there is no way but to hope for a centrally led and enabled decentralization. I know it might sound paradoxical and to some extent banal, but I just don't believe in the ability of bottom-up players, including, by the way, municipalities, of being able to match the capital investment that these firms are making right now into AI. So if you're really talking about being able to replicate some of the functionality, you really have to get real and understand the scale of money involved. So despite everything that a lot of economists say about this current economy being dominated by rentiers and nobody investing into anything, I mean, if you look at tech firms, they actually have very high capital expenditure. So Amazon spends, I think, more than any other company in the world on R&D, which is around $15 billion a year. Google spends roughly 13 billion, and Facebook is somewhere around 12. If I remember it correctly. So it's a lot of money. So if we really expect that the municipality of Trento, even if it joins forces municipality of Bolzano, will be able to somehow magically pull off that number out of a hat, I think that's not going to happen. So it requires, but that can, of course can be done differently. You can do it in a way where you will find a niche and a role for cities and municipalities, and you would be able to coordinate it with the nation level. In China, they do it. There are a lot of regional and, of course, their cities are much bigger and much stronger and have much more money. But, there is quite a lot of activity happening locally, which you do not really see happening in Europe. But that said, I think I understand the question about the practicality of all of this, given the current mass in Europe, in Italy, and in many other nation states. I think the only possible solution here is to put this question on the political agenda in a way that, now I'm not talking about Italy, in a way that all political movements and parties will have to confront it as a political issue. And not just talk about taxation and not just, I'm not saying that taxation is not important. I'm not saying that regulating the gig economy with proper labor laws is not important, but that crowds out almost all the other high-level discussions that need to be had, including on issues like industrial strategy, and what does it mean to have an industrial strategy when it comes to artificial intelligence, and what it means to have industrial strategy when it comes to data ownership, right? And what kind of data ownership systems you need to have in place to enable that in a much more decentralized manner. And the reality is that very few political forces anyway in Europe that I see are prepared to tackle this question as a political question. Because you cannot just, because if you really are serious about it, you also have to problematize it as a European issue. It's not just a failure of nation states, it's a complete failure of the European Union as a project to essentially muster up and gather up enough industrial strength and to actually reaffirm the fact that, well, in China, industrial strategy that's actively pursued by the government seems to work, and in Europe, its absence does not seem to work. And I think it's a very basic recognition that anybody who looks at the data honestly will be forced to make. And the problem, of course, here, you will need to be able to pursue a critique of the European project and the reaffirmation of some kind of European sovereignty, if not national one, in a way that would not make you sound particularly xenophobic and nationalist. And it's just a problem that most leftist forces in Europe that's still around and are not fake left forces have not managed to essentially resolve. So, and it's not a problem that you can resolve just by understanding the role that SoftBank plays in contemporary digital capital. That's so, I can tell you more on that, but kind of we'll need to go far beyond the problems pertaining to the digital field. And just two last questions, offline, online, and how much of it is moving offline. What I try to do today is to kind of hint at some of the dynamics that drive these firms. And, I think I'll be very banal and say that what drives these firms is the search for profitability. And in that sense, they don't care whether they do their activities online or offline. They pursue their activities where they expect to generate most profit. So if Amazon expects to be able to get something from the offline data that will allow it to offer better web services in the online world, they'll do it. So in that sense, I think that these firms are very kind of internet agnostic. For that, cyberspace agnostic, if you want to put it that way, then ultimately they don't care. As long as they can put sensors everywhere, they'll take all data you have, offline data, online data, your thoughts, your dreams, they have a smart mattress, they will extract whatever you dream about at night. They don't care, as long as it contributes to the bottom line, they'll do it. So I think we have to be also much less rigid in trying to imagine this industry as somehow operating in cyberspace, and there is another industry that's not. I think ultimately it's that very conception that caused so many problems in our ability to understand what these firms are about. With regards to GDPR, I would really love to say a lot of nice things about it, but you'll read it all by email. No. Look, GDPR, I think, it's a legal instrument. It's a legal instrument which, for certain types of tasks, I think can work remarkably well. I think it also has a somewhat different idea about the necessity of common ownership of data that I have. So there are certain things in my vision that would be very hard to implement within GDPR. But ultimately, I wouldn't look upon a legal instrument to be able to articulate an industrial policy for Europe or any of the individual nation states. Right? Ultimately, that's what, you can say whether it's about seizing means of production or not, but ultimately, that's what I think is missing. And you cannot possibly let European politicians and national ones get away with saying that GDPR will solve the kind of problems which it constitutionally, by default, is incapable of solving. So being conscious of the things that GDPR can solve, I welcome it, but I'm conscious of its limits. And I think the danger is that it will mislead a lot of European politicians into a sense of comfort in which they've been for the last 15 years already, thinking that they actually have a grasp of the situation and they have the means to resolve it, while in fact they don't. And my main fear is that Europe will find itself in a position where, on paper, theoretically, privacy will be protected with all the possible legal instruments imaginable, but in reality, all the other economic rights and social rights will, in some sense, become meaningless because everything from education to health to transportation has been overtaken by commercial providers of those services. So in a sense, you can be saying that you have a meaningful right to the city, but when your city is run by Cisco or IBM, what does it actually mean? Right, so Google, by the way, which is building its own smart city program through Sidewalk Labs. So that's my problem. So, I think regardless of the Cambridge Analytica scandal and everything else, I think the discussion about privacy in Europe is quite robust. But it's not very robust about all the other issues that I think should be up for discussion. And that's what bothers me. So I'm all for GDPR, just think it's a necessary but not sufficient condition. Okay, close.
Dobbiamo chiudere.
Thank you. Thank you. Perché ogni tanto ho ricevuto un'email da Antonina?
Sì, che è
Quella è la
una
figlia.
pro cugina.
Ah.